Okay, welcome to Rational Animal. Today we have Jeremiah Cowart, and we're going to be talking about Christianity and the Nazi Party during World War II. So, Jeremiah, if you could give us just an introduction to who you are and what provoked this or what sparked this interest in this topic, and kind of some of your educational background.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me on. Let's see. So I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Georgia. I got that in 2000. And then I immediately went to seminary. I thought I was going to be a pastor in the early 2000s. I went to Southern Evangelical Seminary, graduated in 2003 with a Master's of Arts in Religion. At that time, I kind of had switched within the Christian traditions into a denomination that wouldn't really allow for me to work as a pastor. So I had to just switch gears altogether, and had 2 children at the time, and a third was on the way. So I went into civil service for many years. I've been 15 years working for Uncle Sam. But now that my kids are older, about a year ago, I started another degree program at Emory University in Atlanta. And I'm in their theology school there. It's another master's program, but it's one that allows me to take a wide variety of courses through many of the departments and schools at Emory, philosophy department, law school, and the Department of Religion. And so in the fall, in my first semester, I just go part-time because I work full-time. But my first semester, there were 2 courses that were on offer. One was taught by a Jewish professor. It was just like an introduction to Judaism. And he works within the Department of Religion at Emory. And then the other course was taught by an individual who has a bit of like background, and it's like a speciality of his, Christianity and the Holocaust. He had actually just published a book with Oxford Press on the topic. And so he taught a course that was called Christianity and the Holocaust. So I was taking these 2 courses in the fall of 2021 simultaneously, a course on Judaism, which eventually would get us into that area, enough. We started in ancient Judaism, but, you work your way all through the history of the Jewish people up before the Holocaust, early 20th century, and then during the time of World War II, and then post period.
I think the first question I have is maybe a relevance or an importance question, because one of the reasons I'm interested in this topic is because I think, there's a lot of talk, obviously, of, political leaders being Nazis and fascists and all that kind of stuff today. There's all sorts of comparisons drawn today with people on the right and the left being Nazis and being complicit with them, or that sort of thing. And I think in the church, we obviously tend to think of ourselves as not being able to go in that direction, which to me is actually kind of scary, because I would think everyone should realize that everyone could go down that path, under the right circumstances. So I'm really interested in what you're thinking in terms of like what was the what we were talking about. What was the sentiment towards Jews by Christians? Were there certain groups that tended to be more anti-Semitic, some that weren't? Was it more of an issue where people in the churches just kind of went along with sort of the political stream, and didn't want to go against the grain or go against the flow in that regard? Or was it more active than that? So I guess to start, could you tell us maybe what you think is the importance of studying this topic? Like what prompted you, and why you might think it's important for others to hear about this?
Sure. I think I went into this course with an opinion about what I guess let me say it like this. I probably thought that most Christians at the time were like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you and your audience know who that is. open and active opposition to Nazism, got him imprisoned, eventually led to his execution. I would have thought that would have been the mainstream sort of, this is what Christians would have been up to at the time. And then I would have thought, well, but if they had not been openly, because not all of us are in a position where we're going to be that brave, because there's other concerns, children. I mean, there's all sort of like ancillary concerns that might keep you from being actively opposed to Nazism, so much so that you would get imprisoned and possibly your life would be imperiled. But at the very least, I would have thought, well, there wouldn't be like enthusiastic support from the Christian community of Hitler or Nazi Party, and I think there would have been more of a, at least on an academic level, like the academics, I thought they would have been opposed generally. And I thought that church leaders at the time would have been opposed generally to Hitler and his party. And as it turns out, it was not that case at all. Why would it have been that Christianity did not fare as well as it might have in opposing the Nazis, or more specifically on the Jewish question? So it's good to learn about this in the same way that you would learn about any other questionable time in Christian history, if you find yourself within this religious tradition.
Do you have some thoughts on maybe some of that background of why the German people, or in particular the German churches, would have been supportive of the Nazi Party?
Yeah, so on the anti-Semitism question, the university climate was such that there were scholars writing in the 1920s and the 19-teens, and even these are scholars that would be fairly well known to Protestants. Like I think one of them, his last name is Kittel. He wrote he was the editor of this massive theological dictionary of the New Testament. A lot of pastors, when I was younger, would have had it on their shelves. And he was an enthusiastic supporter of the rise of Hitler, and I guess what I want to say is that folks like him were not all that rare. There was another scholar named Althaus who was publishing and starting to call into question any sort of association of the Jewish people with anything that was good or positive. These scholars in German universities, which, by the way, at the time, German universities were sort of leading the world in academia in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so these were like the scholars that were the head of their fields, and they started to write things, openly publish certain opinions like Jews were Christ's killers, and they don't really have anything to do with any positive aspect of Christian history. They were the reason why that led to Christ's crucifixion. The blame for that was not laid so much at the Romans, just laid at the feet of the Jews. And there were other bizarre theories that started to arise at the time. One of them, Susanna Heschel, she's a scholar. She's the daughter of a very famous Jewish theologian named Abraham Joshua Heschel. He's incredible in terms of a theologian. I had to read one of his books on the Sabbath in that Judaism course, and it was this amazing theology, just incredible. And so his daughter also became a scholar, and she discovered that there was this movement to recast Jesus as an Aryan, and this sort of predates the war. And that might seem very bizarre, but here was the logic of what these scholars were doing. They were saying, well, Jesus was not a Judean. He's not from Judea. He's Galilean. So, and Galilee is in the northern part of the area. And so because of the Assyrian, the Jewish people, the unfortunate victims over thousands of years of constant warring and then, invasion. And so during an Assyrian invasion, this is when the Aryan people came. And fast forward many centuries and you get to the family, you get to Mary, and the argument was just that she and all the people of that region wouldn't have been properly Jewish. They would have been descended from these Assyrian conquerors. Somehow that was linked in with an Aryan race thing. So this is just one specific example of the kind of stuff you started to see published. It was actually talked about. It would be talked about at conferences. It would be published in papers. And this sort of attempt to revise, the historical account and to sort of separate out the Jewish people from anything having to do with Christianity and to create this strong divide.
Yeah, so it sounds like there were some academics who were actually advocating this anti-Semitism in particular. Like it wasn't making almost like a historical theological case against them. Hmm. What about their adoption of Nazism more broadly, right? So, because it's the National Socialist movement, right? Nazi Party.
Right.
Was there support from the churches for Nazis more broadly? Like, I guess, was there more of a emphasis on the anti-Semitism part in the churches? Was it more emphasis on maybe some issues that Nazis dealt with that they supported that didn't have anything to do with anti-Semitism? How do we parse that out in terms of what the Christian church was actually supporting?
Yeah, it's a great question. Hitler and his party, they do get enough of the vote in the early 1930s. Not a majority, not more than 50%, but I think it was like 37% or something, to where they're like the controlling party and a coalition isn't able to be formed. And so the president just names Hitler chancellor, I think in January of 1933. And so, we could get into a little more of the specifics of like who were early supporters among the Christians in Germany. Is that where you would like to go?
Yeah, like who were the early supporters, and what exactly, or do we know what exactly they were supporting? Like, were they supporting like this strong nationalist thing? Like, were they supporting specifically anti-Semitism? Were they supporting, like, what were they, like, yeah, who were they? What were they actually supporting?
Right. So it's the mid-20s when Hitler finishes Mein Kampf, and that book starts to get published and it starts to get distributed and sort of widely read in German society at the time. So if you can imagine, from the time of the mid-20s to he's made chancellor in 1933, the anti-Semitism is very crystal clear in Mein Kampf. And so if this is a book that's getting widely read and widely distributed among the people, the people are starting to get exposed to these ideas. They know the source of them. It's this guy, Adolf Hitler, who's leading this party. And then when he gets elevated to chancellor by the then president in Germany, the people have already been exposed to, and they're very familiar with what this party's about. They're also familiar with the anti-Semitism. Now, but anti-Semitism comes in many forms. It's not every anti-Semitite is going to be capable of murder. Early on in the Nazi Party, Hitler advocates for a boycott of Jewish services and stores and so on. So that's a form of anti-Semitism, right? But You could be a German person who reads that at the time and is not thinking in your head, oh yeah, this is going to eventually lead to concentration camps and
Sure.
extermination. No,
Yeah.
no. Yeah. So I mean, so there's lots of ways to be anti-Semitic, but I think the cultural climate then was there was general anti-Semitism.
And was that in Germany? Is it broader in Europe? Uh,
I think it is. It's definitely broader. Um, if you start looking at the Jewish diaspora in Europe, one interesting thing about this Hitler question and Jews is that when you look at the demographic breakdown of Germany at the time, I mean, I think it was less than 1% were Jewish. That's a really tiny portion of population of Germany. Now there were an enormous amount of Jews living in Poland at the time. I think it was around 3 million. It was a lot. A huge percentage of all the Jews in Europe were sort of centered in Poland, where a lot of the concentration camps ended up being, and then also in the Soviet and Russian areas. That's where the majority of Jews were just at this period of time. But yeah, it's a curious question that Hitler would have laid so much at the feet of these people who comprise less than 1% of German population. Curiously, he's very opposed to Jews in Mein Kampf as being the causes of communism, and that's a very odd association. I think it had to do with like Karl Marx's ancestors were Jewish.
Okay.
I mean, because if you know Karl Marx, he certainly doesn't, he's not a practicing Jewish person, and he's not very friendly to religion generally. So in Mein Kampf, Hitler opposes communism on the one hand and blames Jews for it, but he also opposes capitalism on the other hand and also blames Jews for it. And there are historical reasons why Jews were involved in finance and money lending, and we could get into that if you wanted to. But
yeah, is that part of the, because presumably the rhetoric against Jews at the time was not merely, oh, they're Jewish and inherently bad because for no reason. Like they probably had some kind of reason for thinking that Jews were bad, right? I mean, Christ killer's one of them. But also there was a sort of characterization of them as maybe not being honest in their financial dealings and things like that. Were there reasons like that were given by those who were advancing this sort of anti-Semitism?
Capital question, the finance question. So there's a historical phenomenon that happened in the Catholic Church. One of its councils in early modernity actually anathematized the practice of usury. That's the lending of money at interest. And so the Catholic Church took a very strong stance against any Christians participating in usury. And I'm sure this had an effect on Protestant too. They probably didn't follow it as closely they wouldn't consider themselves like non-Christians anymore if they participate in usury. But the practical effect is that, well, if most of Europe is Christian, and if most of this Christian Europe is against usury, well, who's gonna lend money then? And so Jews had already been restricted from certain types of work and service. It's a long history of this in Europe in modernity. They're always sort of sequestered from what they can participate in a society in terms of jobs, where they can live, civil service, and so on. And so Jewish people just get sort of pushed into this industry of finance almost accidentally as a result of the church's opposition to usury. So they do start to have a pronounced role in finance and lending. And, they have high positions when it comes to anything in that industry at the time. And so there is historical reality to, the association of Jewish people with the lending of money at interest and banking and finance. But where it starts to get spurious is where you ask the question, well, why are they there? Why is it because they're trying to control the world economy?
Is
Or is it more that Christian Europe just kind of pushed them there because this was one of the industries they could work in?
was that some of the rhetoric, was that they had gotten into finance through some kind of accident of history, and then that was leveraged to spin a narrative about them becoming like sort of this Illuminati group or something like that? It's kind of controlling everything. Is that
If you ever read Mein Kampf, that's definitely how it comes across.
okay?
So the communist issue and the capitalist issue, they're both. He interprets both of these phenomena as ways of trying to control Europe,
Right.
and they're both Jewish initiated and dominated.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what he sees.
So, do we have reason to think that there were German churches who were supportive of Hitler and Nazism that weren't anti-Semitic? Like, do we have any indications in their writings that they weren't anti-Semitic, but they were for maybe some of these other things that Nazis say they were for?
I think so. So if you do the breakdown of the religious landscape in 1933 when he rises to power, we'll just focus on Germany. About 2/3 of Germany was Protestant at the time, so about 66%. Most of the rest would have been Catholic, and of the Protestants, we just stay with the Protestant question for a second. About 20% of that 66% of the population was opposed to Nazism. They would speak publicly against it. Now, whether they were uncomfortable how the Jews were being treated was a separate question, but they were opposed to Nazism. Karl Barth is an example of this, very famous Protestant who was pretty openly opposed to everything that Nazism stood for. So he's a great example. He was probably the main writer behind this document called the Barmen Declaration at the time. And then, so that's 20% who are very much opposed. It's about 35% of the Protestants were enthusiastically supportive of Hitler and Nazism. Sort of looked at him like the latest Messiah. It was one of those things. This guy's going to save us. He's a gift from God. I mean, this is the language that would be used by, a pretty decent percentage of Christians at the time. And I would say the other 45 roughly percent of Christians, I mean, it's just, these numbers are from scholars, were neither openly opposed nor really enthusiastic. They were just sort of like going like, okay, this guy's like running the country now, let's just see what happens, that sort of thing. So 20% opposed, 35% enthusiastically supportive of Hitler and Nazism, and the majority, 45%, were just somewhere in between.
And was this different in Catholic circles?
So the Catholic Church, prior to the rise of Nazism, anyway, when this party was first formed, was publicly and very, very deliberately opposed to this party. They would publicly speak out against Nazi Party. They would oppose them. They would, the bishops would say, disaffiliate yourself from this party. We don't want any parishes associated with this, and stuff like that. Now, the record for the Catholic Church isn't great after that time, but at least in the early days of the Nazi Party forming, before Hitler rises to chancellor, there was this public opposition from the Catholic Church.
And what was the opposition grounded in? Was it grounded in it being socialist? Was it grounded in being anti-Semitic? Was it grounded in all of these things, other policies? Or
unfortunately, I don't think the anti-Semitic. Now, some Catholics would write about the anti-Semitism, but generally it was seen as so historically, Martin Luther, one of the reformers, he has a theology of sort of like two kingdoms. Like there's the kingdom of God, and then there's the kingdom of the world, and sort of never the twain shall meet. And the kingdom of God is concerned about spiritual matters, and the kingdom of this world is just concerned about material matters. And when you have a theology like that, it allows you to just have this bifurcation in your mind between what's going on in government and whether we should care or do anything about it, and then what's going on in the hearts of the people. And this had an influence on German Protestant theologians throughout the centuries. I would say even early Bonhoeffer seems to incline toward this. He later abandons this sort of two-kingdom thing, but early on he advocates it. Barth opposes it. So the Catholic Church, I think, because of its history of sort of like social justice and seeing the church as being fully in the world, and Catholic Church creates hospitals, creates universities. It just has this more lived theology and this social justice kind of record, that it opposes Nazism more for, I think, just being in line with this is just another power party, and the power party that seems to advocate some not great things, because again, Mein Kampf had been published and people were aware of what was advocated at the time.
Okay, so early on,
by the leader of this party,
there were a good bit of official opposition to Nazism from the Catholic Church. Did that change over the years? And then
there's an odd thing that happens in the election when Hitler's party rises to power, is that even despite this opposition from bishops and so on in the area to Nazism, there's no way that Hitler's party could have gotten the controlling percentage in that election without the vote of the Catholic bloc. So the Catholics who were in politics then, more or less just helped his party to get that controlling percentage. So that happened, strangely or not, I don't know. And then later on, one of the earliest, I think maybe it was the earliest government that had acknowledged the Nazi government and had made like a formal agreement with them was the Vatican, the Holy See. They make this concordant. They write it this concordant, which is just this bilateral agreement between the Holy See and this newly ascended Nazi party. And it's just a way of sort of recognizing the Nazi party as, okay, y'all are running Germany. Here's what we'll agree to with you. And I think it had an effect of, it sent a message, probably a strange message, if I had to guess. Who knows what the Pope at the time was really thinking? Maybe he was thinking, well, this is just a guy who may come and go. No big deal. Lots of people have risen in recent years in Germany who tended to be scary, but they were later deposed and they weren't a problem. And perhaps that was it. Who knows?
Do you know if Orthodox, like the percentage of Orthodox in Germany at the time was, and did they have a different response, or was it similar? Or
I think it would have been tiny. I think the percentage of Orthodox in Germany would have been very small. So the numbers are roughly like 2/3 were Protestant, almost a third. The remainder were Catholic. You would have had 1% roughly Jewish, and then 1% sort of disaffiliated, agnostic atheists.
Okay.
And then the other 1% would have been just whatever, maybe some Orthodox and anything else.
Okay. So I'm curious as if there are writings from everyday church people that we have that would show them supporting some of the worst elements of Nazism. Do we have something like that?
That's a good some everyday. Oh, just like
public. They're like public opinion kind of pieces in newspapers, or do we have?
Well, Yeah, there were. So in 1933, the boycott idea that's suggested by the Nazi Party is published in a newspaper. And yes, the sentiment of the public toward Jews begins to take a pretty dark turn immediately after that. And there are a lot of historical. So, other than boycotting Jewish businesses and making them suffer in that way, there are a lot of other things that begin to happen. The Nazi Party suggests, and they're doing this in print and so forth, that maybe Jewish people shouldn't be allowed in our public schools because of the influence they would have with our Aryan children. And civil service. There were a lot of Jewish people who were also in civil service, whether that's some sort of judgeship in the courts somehow. They held professorships. There were a lot of World War I veterans, Jews who fought for Germany, who bled and suffered in the war. And they certainly thought, because they were veterans, even though they're Jewish, they're veterans, that the party wouldn't look unfavorably on them because of their efforts there. But yeah, as far as I know, the climate generally in print, if you're not talking about like the academics and so on, that papers started to follow that boycott announcement with just some unfavorable stuff. There started to be cartoons. And they're really kind of nasty, so they would present like a Jewish guy with like a giant nose and he's sort of fat and sort of hairy and greasy. And there'd be some nasty bit of propaganda, along with the cartoon. This started showing up pretty regularly at the time.
Were there indications of that prior to the rise of the Nazi Party? Presumably that sentiment was there prior to the Nazi Party, right? Because it appealed to something that was there, but this just sort of stoked the fires and made it spread more. Do you think, or was it just?
Yeah, I thought. Well, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that I think once this guy who wrote Mein Kampf is elevated to the highest position of power in the country, and then he starts advocating for this boycott. So I think it just gives the people license. Whereas maybe the anti-Semitism would have been more in the academic circles. Maybe you'd hear it a little bit from the pulpits in the 20s. By the time you get to where your leader is openly anti-Semitic, I think it probably just gave the people more of a license to be very public about it. Whatever they would have harbored like indoors previously, now they're just like, oh, this is just sort of the national opinion.
So some of the famous Christians who opposed it, like Corrie ten Boom, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, like Barth, how were they received by the general public? How were they received by academics? Do you know?
That's a good question. Yeah. So Barth had an interesting history. He comes out quite early in opposition to Nazism, and he sees it as falling victim to this sort of two kingdom mentality, and that he's trying to alert Protestant Christians to the fact that no, you have to. If you see a party rise and you think there's something morally corrupt and morally wrong with it, well, you have to oppose it. He's had almost like a social justice opposition. Like we need to stand against this party. Enough time passes, he actually gets booted out of the country. He loses his, I think he had a professorship, and so Barth spends his remaining time in, I think, Switzerland, and he has most of his academic career, where he writes his church dogmatics and stuff, is written in Switzerland, German-speaking portion of it.
Right. Okay.
He later writes, I referenced it earlier, this Barmen Declaration, or at least it's attributed to him. The scholars think that he wrote it. It's sort of an anonymous document wherein he just more critically opposes what he thinks is, the dangerous theological presuppositions of Nazism, and that it's dangerous that the German churches seem to have just kind of gone along with this. I mean, there was some pretty wild things that happened in the German churches at the time after he gets elevated. So some churches would start to put the Nazi swastika flag on their altars. I don't know if you know about this. It's pretty wild. But they'd have like a Christian flag, maybe with a cross, and then they have the swastika flag. And this wasn't that out of the ordinary, because again, 35% of Protestants were very enthusiastic about Hitler and his party. Hitler actually makes that illegal. He wants to distance himself from any of the churches, Catholic or Protestant or anything at all. It's just like, Nazi is just a government thing, and then y'all Christians can just go do whatever you're doing over there. No more flags in your churches, that kind of thing, which is an interesting turn. But I think go ahead.
Sorry, you're saying that Hitler said these things to the churches? No more flags in your churches, that kind of thing?
Yeah, he actually banned the hanging of the Nazi flag in churches, either at the altar or anywhere in the church.
Okay.
So he wanted to disassociate his party and that regime from any sort of religious institutions. And it didn't matter to him which institutions were trying to do it. He just made it unlawful, made them take it down.
Okay.
Which is fascinating.
Was there something that he did want to associate with in terms of a religion or an ideology or something like that?
Yeah, so when you read Mein Kampf, he will pretty frequently refer to capital P providence. He'll use this sort of, I guess you would say, like deistic language, like something like the American founders, the way Jefferson or someone would have talked. So God is out there, but he's just sort of like this force that's sort of moving along history and that kind of thing. So it'd be very pretty far afield from any kind of classical theism.
Okay.
And another part of Hitler's sort of ideology in Mein Kampf, and this is very important for his whole project, he lives in the wake of The Origin of Species. He lives after 1859 and Darwin's ideas, and he's very impressed by those ideas, but he sees them in a social human context. So in other words, he sees the success in his mind of imperialism and colonial Europe, that white people had basically spread to Africa and the Americas and the Caribbean and had gone in and basically utterly dominated these people. And he sees that as Providence's way of showing that Aryan people are meant to control the world. So it's very much like a social evolution idea. Like the Aryan people, the white people are the fittest, and the way we know this is just by looking at recent history, the recent history of imperialism and colonialism. He's very impressed that a tiny little island country like the UK, Britain, could have gone and did what they did, spread throughout the world. I mean, Britain went east, just as it went India, mm-hmm. right? Britain went all the way. It was trying to do this global power structure. And for Hitler, he's like, wow, that's amazing. And I guess that means white people are supposed to rule. So it's a social Darwinism, you could almost call it.
Yeah, I watched a documentary where they were talking about sort of the social Darwinism involved in forming the concept of other races as inferior and
right.
Interesting.
Yep.
Yeah. So the churches in particular, were their sentiments basically in keeping with well, I guess the churches were the culture, right? If you're saying that, if you're talking about the percentages of Protestants and Catholics, and then not very many atheists or agnostics and that sort of thing, so that just was the culture.
It was 97% were affiliated with Christianity.
Okay.
In 1933. Yeah. So yeah, the culture was just Christian, for sure.
What are your thoughts on maybe the faith of Hitler then? Like, was he? It's because I'd heard that the Nazis and Hitler were involved in. Excuse me. That they were involved in like Norse mythology, like they had really had a fascination with that. They had fascination with Darwinism. They had a fascination with like all sorts of different ideas, sort of like a hodgepodge of beliefs. Do you know if that's the case, or?
That's actually an area I don't know much about, other than what he expressly says in Mein Kampf. I'm not sure what his views were on Norse or any sort of, but I could see him being impressed by any sort of religious or spirituality that had like power, embedded within it.
Do you see, or have you seen parallels between the church's response to Nazi Germany and maybe the church's contemporary response to some of our political leaders? Parallels,
possibly.
differences.
I mean, possibly. I'm a little bit outside of the evangelical American mainstream. Not to say that I ignore it, but I am a little bit outside of the ongoing conversation from a lot of the leaders. But I do follow some of them, and
or even in Catholic circles, if you're more familiar with Catholic circles too, that would be interesting to.
Right. Let's see. There is so that Donald Trump's slogan in 2016 was "Make America Great Again." There is a historical antecedent, which is "Make Germany Great Again." That there is a connection that scholars have made between this. This was almost a phrase that the Nazi Party, was used. And that this phrase would be used by people who were hopeful toward the Nazi Party, that they would make Germany great again, because that was the whole thing, that Germany was a great empire, and it had fallen as a consequence of World War I and the outcome and the Treaty of Versailles. And so we need to reassert ourselves as a great power, because Hitler very much saw the rise of America, to the west, but he also saw the threat of an oncoming Soviet power. And presumably he wanted to create an intermediary, middle sort of Germanic, European, another global superpower that could rival the rising America and the rising Soviet power. So, make Germany great again. So, "Make America Great Again," a slogan of former President Trump. People had made those associations. I really doubt whether Donald Trump had any consciousness of that. I think he was probably thinking more back to Ronald Reagan, recent history.
Yeah.
"Make America Great." Yeah, and but if you look at something like the Capitol riot, January 6th, I don't know, like that would probably get me outside of my area of knowledge base. But I can see an association with like how some are looking to Donald Trump in the way today as some would have looked in Germany of the 1930s to Adolf Hitler. Not so much like come in, take over the country and exterminate those people. No, just like looking for kind of a savior and identifying this person as the one who's going to save either your party or the country, that sort of thing. So maybe a loose association, loose connection.
Yeah, because I wonder about some of these connections because my I'm thinking is that in history there's probably a lot of parallels. You know, some good leaders who have had that sort of thing in mind, and maybe that kind of slogan in order to, or as they rose to power, and then but you have Hitler doing that also, and Donald Trump doing that also. So I don't know how to parse out exactly like all of the parallels. I just don't know enough historically to be able to parse that out and say, all right, you know, here's some serious parallels between Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump. But I suspect, and you can tell me what you think about this, I suspect that the morally relevant factors, there's at least some interesting morally relevant differences between what Adolf Hitler is selling and what Donald Trump is selling. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
If I remember correctly, Donald Trump early on was asked about if he believes in the idea of American exceptionalism, like if America is uniquely great and blessed by God in the world. And if I'm remembering correctly, he actually said no. I mean, he thinks America is great and has a lot of potential, and I mean, I'm sure he loves this country as a lot of other Americans do, and he's patriotic. But he actually distanced himself from that idea. So Hitler would have been absolutely all about German exceptionalism or Aryan exceptionalism. So there's a discontinuity there between those two people, if I've got the historical record right with former President Trump. Let's see, what was the other part of your question?
No, I think that, you know, are there morally relevant points to be made in terms of the discontinuity between Hitler and Trump? Adolf Hitler and his relationship to the church, how parallel and analogous is that to Trumpism or Donald Trump and the Christian church?
Yeah, interesting question. Let's see. Yeah, so America is still very much a Christian country, so it's a relevant question. We've alluded to already that there was that both of these individuals kind of have a cult of personality. That, I mean, if you look at historical videos and footage of Adolf Hitler, and there's plenty to see with Donald Trump, I mean, you do see a charisma. You do see an ability in both of these individuals to kind of work a crowd and to like know the crowd and like get in tune with it and like get them riled up and respond to it. So they both have this sort of charismatic personality. They both have this almost a cult of personality where people would imbue them with something just by virtue of having gone to one of their rallies, you know, and just, oh, wow, look at this guy speak. He's so on point. He always knows what to say, and he speaks with such enthusiasm. So those things seem to be very much in common. And in terms of, you know, it's an interesting fact that we had 4 years of the presidency of Donald Trump. And so we got to see really who this individual is, at least in terms of being a leader. And I don't want to go into any of the steal the vote stuff, but it's fascinating enough to see the numbers that came out to vote for him in 2020. They were high. It was whatever it was, 70-something million. So it isn't as if his presidency ruined like a vote. He still got an enormous number, just of the sheer numbers of people to vote for him in 2020. He didn't win the right states, which is fascinating to think that this person showed us, for all his moral sort of foibles and things that we maybe don't love about him, and constantly on Twitter and just all the stuff that he does. He still carries that loyalty. I think he won more actual numbers in 2020 than he did in 2016. Just didn't win the right states. So that says something about the American public's allegiance to him. And I do know that plenty of the people who are on his side are, you know, they fall in the evangelical camp. He's got some, you know, highly traditionalist Catholics who support him as well. So And the January 6th connection, I think what worries people is that Hitler was elevated to the role of chancellor by the then president of the Weimar Republic. His name was von Hindenburg. This was in 1933 in January. A year later, Hindenburg passes. He dies. And what Hitler does a couple of weeks after his passing is abolish the office of the president in Germany. There's no more office of the president. It's just me. It's just Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
So the January 6th thing, the undermining of democracy or the overturning of a democratically, held election. I think that if people are trying to look for historical parallels between Hitler and Trump and their supporters, they're trying to look in that direction. It's not necessarily that we're saying that Trump is another Hitler, that he would exterminate people, that he would try to cause a war. But would he sort of, the historical accident of the president dying a year after Hitler becomes chancellor, would he do something like, well, there's just no more office of the president now. I'm just going to run this thing. I think that's probably from the left where the concern, if I had to imagine one, is
Sure.
probably there.
Sure.
Yeah. Would he do something similar to that?
Right, yeah, because from a conservative perspective, a lot of the rhetoric of, say, the current president, of, Trump supporters being like the number one threat to democracy and that sort of thing. Yeah. From the conservative perspective, it's like, that's absurd. But from the left, if they're drawing these kinds of parallels, like, you could see why they would think that,
Yes, I can see it. Anyone who knows about the history, has paid a little bit of attention, and then knows this current individual, Donald Trump. Yeah, the connections are not far to see. Other than the cult of personality and the charisma, there's also this this sort of self-love that you kind of see in both individuals. Like,
Yeah.
Hitler thought very highly of himself. Donald Trump seems to think very highly of himself. Hitler's education wasn't extensive. Donald Trump's education is not extensive. Yeah, so, you could try to draw these parallels. I don't know how far they go.
Yeah.
Most of my family is very staunchly Republican, conservative. So, and I just don't have the kind of personality that would ever, have a problem with like a Trump voter or someone who's opposed to Trump. So I'm not really politically oriented in that way. Like, I don't care that much about it. But I know that even in my own family, he has a ton of support. And I think a lot of that is identified with this sort of charisma, a little bit of narcissism, seeing the power that he can have when he's at one of his rallies, power on the crowd, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that, because I even as a conservative, right, I love that he was pro-life, and I love a lot of the fiscal policies. You would know more about the immigration thing, right, with your job and everything, but I generally think you should come in legally. So those kinds of things. But I grew up in a charismatic Pentecostal church, and I went to one church in particular that was very cultish, right? Very manipulative. The leader was and while that was a very difficult few years there at that church, just trying to sort things out. Got to the point where I almost left Christianity because of it. Thank God that I went through that experience, because I got to see certain personality quirks or personality trends that lead to cultic leaders. And I completely see that in Trump. Even though I like his policies, I completely see that in Trump. Like, he has the mindset of a cult leader. So I get the worry of the left, and I do understand that. I wonder if the parallels, and this is kind of what I'm asking too, is I wonder if the parallels, though, sometimes are exaggerated, and not taken in the broader context of these are also some of these characteristics may also be common to good leaders, right? Like people who have charisma, people who are going to say, stand up and say, no, we will not do this kind of thing. What are your thoughts, though, on maybe some relevant differences, do you think, between... Well, and actually, let me take a step back. Rather than comparing the similarities and differences between Trump and Hitler, what are some of the similarities and differences between the church in Nazi Germany and the church today?
That's a great question. And yeah, I do. And I don't think they're wonderful. So, one of the issues that any Christian would have, or anyone even outside of the tradition would have with Christianity and the Holocaust, the fact that Germany could have been 97% Christian, and Poland could have been overwhelmingly majority Christian, and just really all of these areas, Europe, the complicity and the not really doing anything to help Jews, not openly, not like publicly, not like really putting your own life on the line, risking. Now, some did. We know there are instances who did. But the worry is, why does it seem to be so few? Why are the Oskar Schindlers rare, and the Corrie ten Boons and the Bonhoeffers? Like, why can't we just rattle off a list of thousands? Why wasn't there sort of overwhelming Christian opposition to Nazism and protection of Jews? That's the question. Why is it like it's like this guy and then that woman and then this guy over here? Seems rare, which seems odd. One of the camps that later becomes a concentration camp, Dachau, was built in the early days of the Nazi Party and was originally used to sort of like, let's go gather some of these people who oppose us in government. And we're just going to kind of put them over here, I'm not going to exterminate them. That wasn't the original idea, but like just get them out of the scene and go shuffle them off over here. Mm. But then Dachau later becomes a full-blown concentration camp. So, yeah, the worry that I have for religious supporters of Donald Trump today would have been similar to the worries that I think people would have had back in the time, that Karl Barth would have had. Like, why are you people not seeing some clear difficulties with this guy? His self-absorption, his narcissism, he's just all about charisma and riling up the crowd, and then look what he's publishing.
Yeah, because I think that my concern is there's the parallels between Nazi Germany and contemporary political relationship between the church and government leaders. But if you take a step back, my guess is, I would think, is that you would find a whole bunch of really good leaders that have similar qualities and really good church people who have a sort of excitement or exuberance for those leaders, Mm-hmm. And then at that point, the question is of discernment. Which one is which? Because there could be a charismatic leader who's really good, who does a lot of good, who has the interests of the people at heart. That's at least possible. And then you could have churches who are really excited about that, and that isn't in itself anything problematic. Would you agree with that? And if so, then does that mean that really the parallels, the morally relevant parallels, come down to maybe something different than just even charismatic leaders and churches being excited for particular leader, this leader or that leader? What do you think about that?
I think so. Yeah, I think there's something to that. Like if we revisit briefly the statistics of, German Protestant support for Nazism, it's like 35%. So maybe a third were really enthusiastic. The bulk of them, 45%, were just like, let's just see how this goes. And then 20% vehemently opposed. So, perhaps there may be a sense in which just this kind of breakdown of humanity just tracks over time. Like a third of us who are religiously oriented people, we tend to get very enthusiastic, either about a party or about a person. The bulk of us are like, I guess he seems better than the other guy, and well, let's just see how this goes. Mm-hmm. And then the smaller percentage of us will be just like out there and publicly. We'll be on Twitter and tweeting, and we'll just be talking about all our opposition to that. We can't elect this guy, but that ends up being the minority. So yeah, I mean, maybe if those statistics tend to track over time, I could see, you could see, because there are certainly very enthusiastic people that are all about either of the parties. Tends to be Democratic, I guess, is not so much. At least now, they didn't really have a candidate that was a cult of personality. But if a Gavin Newsom were to run, or someone who does have this charisma, you know, something along the lines of an Obama, it would be similar to what Eleanor Stump had done, and many others who just loved Obama. And this cult of personality thing, like it was with Reagan, like it was in some degree like with Clinton and with Trump.
That's I almost wonder if that's just a more inherent part of the relation between a state and its leader, or the people and its leaders. I mean, you know, this sort of egalitarian, like everybody's the same and no one, you know, no one's above anyone else. In terms of function, for sure, right? Like, it never bears out, right? Like in work, in government, there's always a hierarchy of some kind, right? And there's almost there are people nowadays who would like kind of have a sort of nostalgic longing for a king type figure, right? You know, Christ is viewed as a king type figure, or not just a type figure, like literally a king to rule and reign, and that's something that Christians long for. But that's not just in Christianity. I mean, every world religion has some kind of leader who they don't just like, okay, they're the boss, so we just listen to them. Like, very often it's much more than that. They're our leader. They're our revered leader. They're the people who are going to make this all work.
That's right.
I just wonder, like, sometimes when the parallels are drawn between, and I say this because, you know, obviously Hitler's always and the Nazis are always like the devil, and and everything is referenced in relation to the Nazis and Hitler. But that worries me a little bit, because it seems like if you say that, then you diminish the potential for evil from everyone else, like including ourselves.
Oh, true.
You know, and it's like, I know that I could be a terrible human being, like, and I don't know under what circumstances, but I could be that way. I don't know anyone who couldn't be that way, you know. So I am wondering, just like, if maybe what we're doing in our analysis, like our culture is doing in our analysis of the parallels between Nazi Germany and, say, certain political figures in the church here in America, is not taking into consideration this deeper sense of, no, there's just the nature of social hierarchy, right? Like the people on the top, the elected leaders, or the king, or the emperor, or the daimyo, or whoever, like, they have a certain respect because of their position and a certain hope in them that if we follow them, they will bring us into something better. Like, that seems ubiquitous, right?
It definitely does.
I mean, go
ahead.
Sorry.
I was going to say, and the tendency to just sort of go along and follow them, like, in spite of whatever you might see that would cause you to, in a different circumstance, sort of question this person and either question their character or something. But humans just have this tendency to sort of like go along to get along. You know, I was talking about this the other day with my daughter, and we kind of brought up the Holocaust thing, and kind of led into a discussion of slavery too. And they're both instances of, why weren't more people doing something about that? Like, we look back on it now, and we like to think, oh yeah, had I lived 200 years ago, I totally would have been an abolitionist. Or, you know, had I lived in 1940s Germany, I'd have been out on the streets, handing out pamphlets. But we have the historical record. We see what it was.
Right.
We see that early on in this country, there was like one Christian group, a tiny Christian group, that were abolitionists, and most people weren't like Yeah, slavery is amazing, but they weren't really working to overturn it either. And so you have a similar phenomenon during the Holocaust. You might have had people who were internally thinking whatever, but they weren't really going to do anything about it. So yeah, I think there's definitely in humanity this tendency to just sort of, let's just let this play out. Let's not really get involved. It's messy when you get involved. It can be a little scary. And a result of that is that we just kind of sit back and we don't really criticize the people that we were earlier fans of, whether it's Obama or whether it's Clinton or whether it's Trump. Yeah.
One of the things that really interests me about this conversation is its application and relevance for today. And like what you're talking about in terms of the number of people that just kind of went along with stuff, and what you just brought up about, if I were back then, I would have been X or Y. I guarantee most people who say that are wrong. Like, if you would have been back in Nazi
Absolutely.
Germany, you would have went along with the regime. You would not have bucked the system. Like you said, it's like there's very few people who do that.
Very few.
And what are some of the causes of that? I mean, at least some of it could be even you don't have the insight into what's going on to be able to resist it. You don't even really have a full picture, enough picture or the conviction to do that. Maybe you're focusing on this instead of that. What do you think? What do you think brought out the Dietrich Bonhoeffers, the Barts, the Oskar Schindlers? Like, what do you think made them different?
There was this one group. It's a student group, and they weren't really religiously motivated in Germany. I think they were called the White Lotus. Tiny group. It's like a professor and like a handful of his students. But they started passing out pamphlets in opposition to, not like saying, "Oh, look, here's what they do. Here's what they're doing to Jewish people." And this was when the war was already going. I think it was 42, maybe. But this is the one group you hear about, and there was like a handful of them. And so it's like, they all ended up getting arrested, and they ended up either spending a long time in prison, or they just they ended up dying in camps. So yes, you're right. Statistically, people like that are very rare, and most of us would not have been a part of the White Lotus, and we would not have put ourselves out on the line like that. Certainly not for strangers that aren't our friends or our family. We did, and psychologists, I guess, get into this. We will definitely put our lives and our livelihood out there to protect like our children, our spouses. But once you get outside of our immediate sphere of connection, no, it's just part of a human proclivity, and I'm not sure what accounts for the saints and heroes among us. Interesting question.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate your time and thoughts on this topic. It's been really fun. I hope you can come back and do something else with me.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.